5. Tell me about weddings, Claire asked as she and Alice carried the nut cake they had made to the feast table, where it would be placed with the festive puddings and sweets. Does everyone have one? Did you? Alice laughed. Not me, she said. But most do, when they reach an age, as Martin and Glennis. When they choose each other, and the parents say aye, then we have the hand fasting, always in summer, usually at new moon. Summer. Claire had learned already from Alice that summer is a time of year, the time of sunshine and crops and the birth of young animals. It had been one more thing she had not known. She waited while Alice rearranged some of the other foods in order to make room. Then she set down their cake, and together they decorated its edge with yellow daisies. The village people were gathering. No one, not even the fisherman, was at work today. Babies perched atop their father's shoulders. Claire saw tall Andras with his parents. The three of them scrubbed and dressed in their best clothing. She could see that his mother was not well. She leaned on her son and was flushed with fever, though she smiled and greeted the others. Breen waved to Claire. She was holding Bethan's hand. For once, the three little girls were separate, each with their families. Claire could see that beneath her lace-trimmed apron, Breen's body had thickened with the coming child. Alice thought the time of danger was past and that this one would survive. "Oh, what's that?" Claire asked, startled at the sound. From the path, several young village men approached and the crowd opened to make way for them. One was blowing into a carved flute. Another kept time on a small drum made from an animal skin stretched across a hollowed gourd. The third plucked a string stretched across a long-necked instrument made of wood. Moving in time with the melody, they entered the circle that had opened to admit them as Claire watched from where she and Alice stood at the edge. "It's so lovely. Listen, how they make the sounds go together. I've never heard anything like that before." Alice frowned. "It's music, child. Have you never heard music? Have you forgotten it?" "No, never," Claire whispered. "I'm quite sure." The hand-fasting ceremony ended as Martin and Glennis kissed each other, and the red ribbon that had been wound around them unfurled, loosened, and freed them. The musicians began again with a louder, rollicking tune, and the villagers cheered and turned to the waiting feast. Claire stood silent, awed by the music, puzzled by the concept of love, and moved by both the solemnity and the celebration of the occasion. When she turned to look through the noisy, laughing throng for Alice, she suddenly noticed Lame Einar standing alone on a small rise at the edge of the meadow. While she watched, he adjusted the two sticks that supported him, turned, and hobbled slowly away. For a moment, she thought of running over to invite him back, to entice him to join in, but her attention was drawn by the music. Never had she heard such an enticing thing as music. She was sure of it. And now the villagers were choosing partners, forming lines, and moving in time to the cheerful melody. Surely Einar would enjoy watching, even if he couldn't do the quick hopping steps that they all seemed to know. They could watch together. But when she looked back for him, it was too late. He had disappeared into the woods. Back to daily tasks after the excitement and holiday of the hand fasting. Tall Andres knelt in the field and meticulously tied together the thick branches that would form the body of the mammoth. Then, after he had decided on a spot in the center of the young sprouting crops, he pushed the main branch into the earth and patted the dirt firmly around its base so that it stood upright without tilting. He dressed it, carefully fitting the wide sleeves of a ragged coat over the two stick arms. He tied a sash around the middle to hold the coat closed, but loosely, so the breeze would lift and sway the fabric. He stood back and watched with satisfaction as the cloth moved. The ends of the arm branches, extending from the sleeves, looked like beaconing skeletal hands. Claire, approaching on her way to the stream, watched with a smile. She understood what he was doing, though she had never seen him mom it before. She stopped, watched, then called to Andres. Do you have a ribbon? If you added a long ribbon, it would wave in the wind. He shook his head. I'll bring you one if you like, she suggested, coming closer. He stood back and looked at his creation. A ribbon would be good, he acknowledged, around the neck. Claire laughed. The neck? She asked. There was only the gnarled branch end protruding upward from the patched coat. Andres laughed as well. I'll make the head now, he told her, and showed her the large gourd waiting on the ground. He knelt beside it and with his knife carved a hole at one end. He dug out several inches of the pulpy flesh within, then placed the gourd atop the neck, fitting it down so that it sat firm. Claire could see that it looked, indeed, like a head, and that from a distance the entire marmot would seem a frightening, flapping creature. The crows would surely avoid it, and the crops would be protected. He lifted the yellow gourd off the neck and set it on the ground again. It needs a face, he told her. She sat on the soft earth and watched him begin to carve. First, he gouged 2 circles near each other in the center of the gourd, then scraped at the rind between and below the eyes to create the impression of a nose. Impulsively, Claire tore some handful of grass from the earth and handed them to him. Hair, she said. He laughed and draped the hair over the gourd. It slid away and he looked around. Wait, he told her. I can make it stay. He left her with the gourd lying on the ground and went over to the edge of the woods. As she watched, he found the pine tree he had in mind and pulled a length of one supple branch loose. Oh, he murmured. This is good. He brought it back to where he was sitting and showed her the wetness from the torn end, where the bark glistened. He held it for her to sniff the woodsy pine scent. Alice make a pillow filled with the needles, she told him. He nodded. He was smearing the oozing resin on the gourd. It soothed sleep, he said. Look now. He picked up the torn grass and pasted on the gourd's head, where it settled in tufty clumps, held tight by the sticky sap. They both laughed as he held it up. Some marmot, Andras said with pride. Needs a mouth, Claire reminded him. She pictured the grin on the odd creature. It does. He bent over it, carving meticulously. She watched as he worked. Now and then he drew back, examined his own efforts, and then leaned forward to correct the shape, to trim the curves. She saw him smooth the mouth edges with his finger. He flicked away some tiny shreds of gourd. May I see? She asked him. Wait. He moved his blade to the expanse of yellow rind above the gouged eyes, and she could see him make 3 deep rippled cuts across the broad forehead. He looked at it and laughed in delight. There, he said. He stood, holding it, and placed it carefully over the wooden neck, easing it down into place. There, he said again proudly, and turned with a grin to see her reaction. Claire stared. The grotesque face stared back at her. Its forehead was wrinkled by the wide cuts, which made it look puzzled, and the eyes squinted above the twisted nose. The mouth was a tortured smile, a leer. She caught her breath and felt her heart pound. Andras was laughing. She turned to him, horrified, not knowing why, and cheerfully he twisted his own face into a mimicry of the marmot. He thrust his tongue into his cheek, wrinkled his nose, and creased his forehead. He made a chortling sound. The skewed face, the laughter with it, made something flood into Claire's memory, surging upward in her like a wave about to break. She had made that face once, and thought it funny. Someone had made it back to her. But why? Who? She pulled herself upward from the place where she had been sitting in the grass so cheerfully a moment before. She felt sick suddenly, and began to cry. I'm sorry, she gasped. I'm sorry. Then she turned and ran. sobbing and breathless, down the hillside, as tall Andras stood uncomprehending beside the wretched ragged stick figure with its bulbous head. High above him, two crows wheeled in the sky and cried out. Alice had been busy sorting and separating her dried plants when Claire burst through the door, her face wet with tears, and threw herself onto the bed. It was clear that this was not a thwarted romance or a quarrel with a friend, the usual cause for the weeping of young girls. This was raw and deep. The old woman poured steaming water from the kettle over a few pinches of blue vervain and chamomile, then put the mug of herbal tea into Claire's hand. She watched with concern as the girl sat huddled and shaking in the dim light of the hut. "Something's come back then," Alice said. "Something cruel." Claire nodded. She took a few shuddering breaths and sipped the soothing drink. "It helps to say it," Alice suggested. Claire looked up at her. "I can't," she said. "It was so close. It was there, so close. And I can feel it still, but I can't grasp what it is. What wrung it? Where be you when it comes so close?" "Over on the hillside with Andras. I was helping him build the stick figure to frighten the crows away." A moment. "Yes, that's what he called it. Tall Andras is a good lad. Surely it was nothing he'd done?" Claire hesitated. "I don't think so. I can't remember exactly. We were laughing, and then, well, everything changed. I can't think why. Something brung it." "Want I should ask Andras?" Claire closed her hand around the mug and breathed the tea steam. "I don't know," she whispered after a moment. "I feel so sad." Alice watched her and knew that the herbs in the mug would soothe the panic that had afflicted her, that soon she would calm and likely sleep for a bit, but they would not heal her. It would be hard to heal a girl as desperately wounded as this one. 6. The good weather days continued. The sun turned the wave tips to sparkling jewels, and the fishermen filled their nets each day with their glistening catch. In tall Andress's field, the marmot flapped its loose fabric arms, and the crows, made timid by it, called out harshly and went to other fields, other crops. The gourd had begun to rot in the sun and collapse upon itself, oozing and purple like a bruise. A bold starling swooped and grabbed some of the browning grass that had been its hair. One day it fell sideways into the field. When Claire walked past on her way to gather herbs, she saw only the toppled, ruined remains. The memory it had brought her was no longer there. Andress's mother, Aylwin, weakened and no longer left her bed. Alice tended her there, holding her head so that she could sip warm liquid made from chopped wild sunflower roots simmered in spring water. The medicine eased her cough, but it was a comfort, not a cure. "She'll not live," Alice told Claire. Claire had learned about death already in her time here, for they had buried an old fisherman earlier, and she had helped Alice wash and wrap the gaunt body before his sons lifted it into the box they had built. The fisherman's death had been sudden, though, in his sleep. Now Claire watched day by day as Aylwin drifted in her mind, woke less often, and seemed to shrink. Finally, early one morning, with Andras and his father there, her breath slowed and stopped. The father and son touched her forehead gently as a goodbye and went away. Alice squeezed cloth that she lifted from the pail of water, handed one to Claire, and together they began to wash the thin body. Clean wrappings were folded nearby, waiting. "The day they brought you from the sea," the old woman said, "I washed you like this." "Did you think I would die?" Alice shook her head. "I could see you were strong. You fought me some." She chuckled softly as she patted Aylwin's arm dry and laid it back gently on the bed. "I don't remember." "No, you wasn't yourself yet. It was your sleep self what fought me." "Here." She handed Claire a dry cloth, and together they dried and tidied the dead woman, folding her arms finely across her gaunt chest. Alice brushed her thin hair, and they carefully wrapped her. They could hear the two men moving outside, readying the box. "They'll be needing a woman here," Alice said, glancing around the crude hut. The cooking vessels were unwashed, and the blanket thrown across the chair was stained and in need of mending. "Yes," Claire agreed. "Men don't tend houses well, do they?" "Tall and dresses of an age to wed," Alice said pointedly. Claire shrugged. "He should, then." "It's you he wants." Claire knew it to be true. She blushed. "I'm not of a mind to wed," she murmured. Alice didn't hear, or pretended not to. "He'll want sons." "All men do, I expect." It was something Claire had observed in the village. Sons carried on the outside work. They took on the boats and the fields as their fathers grew old. Alice busied herself with tying the cords that held the wrappings firmly in place around Aylwyn's remains. Claire, silent now, helped her. She thought how proud Aylwyn must have once been to have birthed a strong boy like Andras. They sat back. Their work was finished. In a moment they would call the man, father and son, to lift the woman into her coffin. The village would gather in the morning to place it in the earth. "On that day, the day I tended you," Alice said to Claire, "I saw your wound." "Wound?" "Your belly." Claire placed her hand there protectively. She looked at the ground. "I don't," she began, then faltered. "It's a grievous wound. Someone tended it, stitched it up. There are the marks." "I know," Claire whispered. "One day it will come back to your mind, like everything else." "Perhaps. But I fear this, that you will not be able to give birth. I think it has been taken from you." Claire was silent. Alice leaned forward and turned the flame higher in the oil lamp. It was darkening outside. "There are other ways a woman finds worth," she said in a firm, knowing voice. "Yes. Come, we'll bring the man inside to be with her now." They rose and went out into the evening, where Tall Andras and his father waited in a light rain, their faces resigned. In her mind, Claire made a list of what was new to her. Colors, of course. She was grateful for knowing them now. The red of hollerberries and the red ribbon of the handfasting. She marveled at the vibrancy and vigor of it, and she had come to feel bathed in contentment when the sky was blue, as it was on these late summer days. Sometimes the sea was quiet and blue as well, but most days it turned dark gray-green, with spumes of white blown and dissolved in the air. Claire liked that darkness as well, with its relentless motion and mystery, though she blamed the sea for hiding her past in its depth. Yellow she loved for its playfulness. Yellow Wing, her little bird, came to her finger now when she poked it between the twigs that formed his cage. He hopped onto it and tilted its head at her with a questioning look. She wondered why she had ever been so frightened of birds. They were added to her list of newly learned things, birds and animals of all sorts. She still skirted the cow uneasily when she walked past, but she had become fond of lame Einar's sheep, especially the small ones, who frolicked in the tall meadow grass and showed their pink tongues when they bleated in excitement. Einar told her of wolves, but she had not seen one and did not want to see ever. She took joy in butterflies and scolded the little girls for catching them. "You've ruined it now," she said, looking sadly at the crumpled spotted wings in Bethan's outstretched hand. "It deserved to live and to fly." Together they buried the dead creature, but later she saw the child chasing another. She feared bees and most bugs. "You're like a wee child," Alice said to her, laughing, when Claire backed away nervously from a fat beetle on the bush, where they were gathering large leaves of golden seal. Infusion of golden seal eased the sore throat that sometimes afflicted fishermen after long days in the boats. I've just never seen them before, Claire explained, as she had often of so many things. Her list included lightning, which astonished her, thunder, which terrified her, the frogs, which made her laugh aloud. A rainbow one morning made her almost faint with delight and surprise. 7. Claire joined in the harvesting at the end of summer and the rejoicing after. The crops were brought in and stored, and in the fields the birds picked at the strewn leavings. Apples were ripening still, but the early ones were picked and pressed into cider. She could see that the days were shorter now. In summer, the children had played barefoot into the evening, chasing one another until their shadows grew long. The men fished until there were stars, and still the sky did not darken until they brought their catch ashore. Now, though, the air turned brisk late in the afternoon. The sun seemed to topple down to the edge of the horizon and colored it crimson there until it was gold by the sea and gone. The wind rose then, taking the brown leaves in a whirl from the trees, and smoke wafted from the chimneys of cottages as fires were fed. The smoke carried with it the scent of soups and stews, nourishment for chilly nights. Women unraveled the sweaters their children had outgrown. They rolled the yarn and started again with it, forming new patterns, bright stripes in larger sizes. Nothing was wasted. Boys carved buttons from bone. Tall Andres gave Claire a fringed shawl that had been his mother's. Most days were still sunlit and warm, but in the evenings she wrapped the soft shawl around her. Les Maynard, seeing how she tied the ends to fasten it closed, created a clasp from willow twigs that he'd soaked to a soften and then twisted into a curled design. Carefully, he attached the two pieces to the green shawl and showed her how to fit them into each other and hold the thick fabric tight together. She noticed one morning, early, that her breath was visible in the cold, clear air. Like mist, she said to Alice. Steam, Alice replied. They were on their way to the cottage at the edge of the woods where Breen lived with her fisherman husband and their little girl. Bethan had burst into their hut just before daybreak, shivering with the cold, because she had forgotten her sweater, and breathless with excitement. My mom's pains have begun, and my dad says come, because he wants no part in it. Run back, child, and tell her we'll be there shortly. Alice spoke in a calm voice while she rose, prodded the fire, and reached for the clothing. You'll come too, won't you, Water Claire? Bethan begged. Claire had sat up and yawned. I will. Go tell your dad he's a big baby himself. Claire knew Bethan's father, that he was gentle and loving, but men were not good at this. The little girl giggled. Claire swung her bare feet to the floor and winced at the cold. She reached for the knitted socks that Alice had made for her. Go now, scat, she said, and Bethan, gleeful, left the hut and scampered back along the lane. Yellow Wing, whose cage had been brought inside at the end of summer, shifted on his perch and chirped. Alice rolled the leaf tightly and slipped it between the bars for him to nibble. Claire finished dressing. She fastened her leather sandals over the warm socks and watched as the old woman gathered things from the shelves in the corner. Suddenly, watching, she shuddered. Why do you need a knife? Alice placed the knife carefully beside the quart container of herbal infusion. She rolled them all in a soft leather skin and placed the bundle inside her bag. She added a large stack of clean folded cloth to the bag and pulled its drawstring tight. Some say it eases pain to lay a knife beneath the bed. Is it true? Alice shrugged. Likely not, but if the person thinks it, then the thinking eases the pain. She wrapped her thick knitted shawl around her and hefted the bag over her shoulder. And I need the knife for the cord. Claire pulled her own shawl tight and fastened it with a willow clasp. Bring the lamp, Alice told her. Together, they hurried along the path. Claire held the lamp high, and it made their way easier. But the sky itself was lightening now. The moon was a thin silver against the gauzy gray of earliest morning. Breen's child would be a daylight baby. They could see when they arrived that Bethany in her excitement had dashed about in the shadowy dawn and wakened her friends. Now all three girls, still in their sleeping garments, were giggling nervously in the small room where Breen groaned and twisted on the bed. Alice firmly shooed them back outdoors. Don't come back till the sun is full up, and then you come with your arms filled with flowers from the meadow to welcome the babe. They'll find some dried asters still, she told Claire, and late goldenrod, and it will keep them out from underfoot. The coming baby's father was nowhere in sight. Alice had told Claire that men were frightened by birthing. She had watched lame Einar, though, help his ewes to bear young in early spring. He was both firm and gentle with them, and unafraid. Einar hadn't minded that she stood watching when she came upon the scene. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. When he unfolded the damp legs of a newborn and set it wobbling on its feet so that it could nudge its mother for milk. They don't really need me, he told her gruffly. They can birth alone unless there's trouble. But it's nice you're there to help, Claire said. Einar had shrugged, patted the rump of the nursing ewe, and reached for his sticks to hobble away. Claire watched him for a moment after he turned his back. Then she, too, walked on. But that had been months before. The spring lambs were tall now, playful, and thick with wool. Einar was no longer so shy with her. Once he startled her by making a harsh cackling sound suddenly, and then a series of soft clucks. She looked at him in surprise. You asked me once, could I do other birds? That's a pheasant, he explained. Then he looked up at something very large, soaring above the sea. He gave a long, hoarse call. Black-backed gull, he said. Now he let her help when he gathered the sheep in for the evening. Together they counted. He had never lost one to wolves, he told her, and was proud of that. He loved the new lambs. Wash the knife, Alice directed her, and her thoughts returned to the cottage, where Breen gasped and gathered herself now as the child emerged. Claire saw it was a girl. She heard it cry as she turned and dipped the knife into the water that simmered on the fire. The blade was hot when she wiped it carefully dry with a clean cloth. Don't cut Breen, she implored suddenly. Alice frowned at her. No need to cut the mother, she said brusquely. She knotted the string around the pulsing cord. Then the baby waved a fist in the air and wailed. Sun's rising, Alice said to Breen, and you've got you a fine girl. She waited a moment, then reached for the knife that Claire held, took it, and separated the newborn from its mother with a careful cut. Breen was watching wearily and smiling. Suddenly, Claire stepped forward without thinking, toward the baby that Alice was wrapping now in a cloth, and cried out, Don't take it from her! Alice frowned. Take what? What's troubling you, girl? Give Breen her baby. Alice looked puzzled. She leaned forward and placed the swaddled infant in Breen's arms. And what did you think I was to do, child? Put it out for the wolves? Of course it goes to its mom. Look there. Wee as she is, she knows what to do. Like the lamb wobbling forward to suckle. Breen's baby turned its head against its mother's warm skin, and its mouth opened, searching. Claire stared at it. Then she began to sob and stumbled out of the cottage into the dawn. Behind her, Ellie, her face folded into puzzlement and concern, began to replace her birthing tools into the woven bag. The new mother dozed while her tiny daughter nuzzled and sucked. Outside, in the distance, the little girls were moving about in a gradually lightening meadow, their arms filled with flowers. But for Claire, who stood on the path weeping, the sunrise, perhaps all sunrises to come, was ruined by memory and loss. 8. Haltingly, pausing to weep, Claire told her remembered story to Alice. Astonished, the old woman asked to examine her scar. Her gnarled hands touched the raised pink flesh and followed the map of it with one finger. "Aye," she said, "this is what I saw the day you came, and I knew you'd had a terrible wound. But never did I see until now that it's the size to remove a child. Imagine, to cut a woman like that, or a girl. You was just a girl. The pain would have been so fierce, it would have killed you." "No," Claire explained. "I felt nothing when they cut. Before there was pain, like what Bryn had with the squeezing of the baby. But when they cut, I felt only pressure, the pushing of the knife, no pain." Ellie shook her head as if in disbelief. "How could that be, then?" "There were special medicines, drugs. They took away pain." "White willow brings relief," Alice murmured. "But not for cutting. We have no herbs for that." I felt nothing. "And what of the blood?" Alice again touched the scar. Her finger, its knuckle bent and thickened by age, ran the length of the wound. "I've seen wounds like this. A fisherman caught and ripped a part of the gaff. A hunter clawed and torn open by an animal. I've been called to tend them, but I can do naught but to soothe and comfort. The blood pulses away, and they die from it, from the blood and the pain. They scream from the pain and then weaken as the blood flows. Their eyes die first." The old woman's own eyes seemed to look into the distance, thinking of the terrible things she had seen and could not heal. Claire looked down herself at the scar. "I couldn't see. My eyes were covered." She shuddered a bit as the memory of the mask came to her. "But I felt them cut, and you're right. Of course, there must have been blood. They had tools, I think, to deal with that. I remember a small sound." She thought, and then tried to reproduce it. "Zzz." "And I smelled a burning smell. I think it—" Alice, puzzled, waited for her to continue. Claire sighed. "They had something that we don't have here. Electricity. It's hard to explain. I think they had an electric tool that burned and sealed the blood vessels." Zzz, zzz. Alice nodded, as if it made sense to her. "I burn a wound sometimes, or a snake bite. I use a fire stick to kill the poison. Not for bleeding, though. Not for a huge wound like this one." Claire drew her clothing across the scar, covering it, and the two of them sat together in silence, one with her new and troubling memories, the other puzzling over what had happened to the girl and why. "I must find him," Claire whispered finally. "Aye, you must." "How?" Ellie stayed silent. She told Bryn, watching the woman hold and tend her infant one afternoon. Claire confided in her and described the return of the memories. Bryn listened with shock and sorrow. She clutched her own baby tighter as Claire answered her horrified questions. Neither of them was aware that just outside the cottage, beside the door that had been left partly open for fresh autumn air, the little girls, wide-eyed, were listening. They scampered away to tell others. "A terrible secret," Bethan called it, enjoying the attention she received as she retold the embellished story. Water Claire had had a baby. Yes, young as she was. No husband at all. And they took the baby from her, just stole it away, and she never saw it since. The secret was murmured through the community. Older women lowered their eyes in sympathy. Many of them had lost children in cruel ways, and they knew what strong, lasting grief came with such a loss. Younger ones, jealous of the pretty stranger, tossed their heads in judgment. "No husband, wanton thing. We suspected something like that, so she was tossed out of where she lived." Gladys, who had welcomed Claire's attention at the hand-fasting ceremony in early summer, now smoothed her skirt smugly over her newly rounded belly. "I'll have Alice come to midwife me when my time comes," she said with a toss of her head. "But I don't want her." Tall and dressed, his face set in hard lines, turned away when she saw her. Is something wrong? Claire asked him, puzzled by his cold look. He had always been so friendly. Is it true what they say? Who? And what is it they're saying? Everyone, that you've had a child and no husband. Claire stared at him. The knowledge was still so new to her that it seemed secret. She had yet to think it all through. It was still fragments, some of it, though. From describing it to Alice, she remembered the birth now, clearly and with horror. But child? She had no sense yet of a child. Only something small and newly birthed. It was different where I lived. There weren't weddings. And yes, I gave birth. She found herself speaking tersely to him. She was angered. You can't understand. I was selected to give birth. It was an honor. I was called birth mother. He raised his chin and looked at her with a kind of contempt. You live here now, and you're stained. Stained? What are you talking about? Women who couple in the fields like animals. They have a stain to them. No one wants them after. Oh, now she understood what he meant. She had watched the sheep mating. Einar had had to explain it to her, how it created the lambs. He had laughed, finding it strange that she knew nothing of the process. That has nothing to do with me, she told Andreas defiantly. Or with me, he said coldly. He turned his back and resumed his stacking of wood. Claire watched for a moment, then continued striding on, but her morning was tainted by the encounter. Later, troubled, she told Alice of it while they were having lunch. It's the way here, Alice explained. Foolish, mayhap, but it has always been so. Girls must come to the hand-fasting untouched, or pretend to be, otherwise no one wants them? Alice shrugged and chuckled. People learn to overlook. Sounds to me as if Andras was hopeful to have you. He'll overlook with time if you don't remind him. Claire stood. She fed a piece of spinach to Yellowwing, who hopped happily back and forth on his perch. Then she scraped the leavings from the plates into the bucket. I don't care about Andras, and I never wished to wed. You didn't, she pointed out. Alice grinned. I was a willful girl, she said. Willful? Some said wild. Now Alice laughed aloud. And wanton. Claire found that the laughter was making her own anger subside. Looking at Alice, wrinkled and bent, it was hard to imagine her as a willful, wild girl. But in the unrestrained laughter, Claire could hear a hint of the carefree creature she must once have been. The children, curious about what seemed a mystery, for people spoke of it in whispers, but too young to judge her, were open with their questions to Claire. They were on the beach, gathering driftwood to dry for the fireplace. The wind was sharp and snapped at Claire's skirt. Did it grow in your belly like my mom's? Bethan asked. Claire nodded, resigned to their knowing. She added a bent stick to the pile. Were it a boy? Delwith's eyes were wide. Claire nodded again. Yes, she said. A male. She started herself. Why had she called it that? Everyone knew a baby was either a girl, like Bethan's new sister, or a wee boy. Why had she said that odd word, male, as if she had given birth to a creature of woods or fields? Where did it go, then, your male? Solemn little Ira looked worried. Who took it? Claire smiled to reassure the child. Someone else needed it, she explained. Just as your mom needs these pieces of wood. Let's drag that big one over here and see if we're strong enough to break it, shall we? I'm strong. Look at me, how strong I am. As strong as a boy, as a male. The children strutted and shouted as they ran about in the wet sand. Claire glanced toward the high bank that bordered the beach and saw Einar watching. He balanced a wooden yoke across his wide shoulders, and 2 buckets hung level from either side. He was coming from the spring where he got fresh water. With his shoulders bearing the weight, he was able to still use his walking sticks. Now, seeing her watching, he lifted one hand and waved to her. Claire waved back and smiled. So, she thought, there's one young man who doesn't think me stained. Or is it that I'm now ruined as he is? She watched him make his way along the path, his feet dragging, one after the other. Beside her in the sand, the laughing children imitated Einar, dragging their feet and limping dramatically. And then watching the forward ruts they made, fill with seawater and smooth over.